Hello everybody and welcome to SDG, where the gaming is sort of decent. Today we're going to go over how to recruit and utilize an army in Warhammer 2. To do that, we're just going to simplify some of the objectives of your army, and then we're going to categorize the otherwise staggering array of unit variety in Warhammer 2 into 6 basic groups. We'll talk a little bit about how each of those groups contributes to the overall objective of your army. And then lastly, we'll go over some strategic decisions that you can use in battle to help make the most out of the units you do recruit. So what are the overall objectives of your army? Put simply, they are 1, beat the enemy, and 2, don't die. And even though it sounds like I'm making a meme out of that, it's actually useful to think about them separately. They don't necessarily go hand in hand. When it comes to deciding what sort of unit you want to put in your army, knowing which of those two objectives you need to fulfill at the moment is key. If you find that things are falling apart very quickly despite having high-level or high-tier units in your army, you're probably lacking in durability. And if you find that you can hang in there and fight for quite some time, but you can't seem to pull the win, your army is probably very durable, but lacking in killing power. As to that first part, beating the enemy, you don't always have to kill them down to the last man. Remember that beating their leadership and getting them off the battlefield is often sufficient for the win. As to the second part, don't die, there's a tremendous number of ways to accomplish that. For one thing, you can do the obvious bit and just straight up tank enemy damage with a strong hero, monster, or tough infantry unit. But you can also just outright avoid taking damage by literally dodging enemy incoming fire with a really fast mobile unit, something maybe that flies or is on horseback like a mounted hero. You can hide in the terrain and use trees, for example, to block incoming arrow fire, or position your troops around a corner or behind a hill so that they're out of artillery line of sight. You can use formations like deploying your infantry in a very thin line so that enemy artillery has a tendency to shoot straight through it as opposed to doing damage in depth. You can also throw trash units at the enemy to soak up damage, like easily recruitable free units for Tomb Kings or vampire counts, having an infinite supply of units that you can just throw away like skeletons or zombies. Destroying the opponent's ability to do damage, sometimes sniping a powerful magic caster or an artillery unit, or singling out, okay, these gunners over here are going to do the most damage, finding and identifying the unit that's the biggest threat and then taking it out, kind of neutering the opponent's ability to do damage. And then lastly, healing. If you have a healer in your faction that you can recruit, and several factions have healing magic, and you have units that have enough HP to be worth healing, that can be incredibly powerful and increase your survivability quite a bit for the next fight. All of those are valid strategies for accomplishing the same basic goal, which is making sure your army is in good enough shape to fight again. Alright, so what are these categories I keep talking about? Simply put, they are infantry, missile units, cavalry, artillery, monsters, and magic. So let's take a look at some specifics, starting with infantry. They're the most basic unit category, but also I think one of the most commonly misunderstood. Infantry are best used to increase the survivability of your army by shielding other more valuable units, not to destroy enemy troops. Infantry break down into two basic categories, offensive and defensive. On the screen you can see the archetype for both of those, swordsman and spearman. What you're looking at here are the results of 10 test battles I ran in order to show whether offensive or defensive infantry perform better overall doing what infantry do, which is just slog it out during a fight while the rest of your army tries to kill the opponent. The numbers you see on your screen are the individual men that survived the battle the moment the victory window popped up. I captured the screenshot at the same time in every fight. You can see that on average, by far, the spearmen performed much better than the swordsman at surviving. Not necessarily at killing the enemy, but at surviving. And when you take into account that I'm using other things, like in this case crossbowmen, to do the killing, surviving is what you want your infantry to focus on doing. The number at the bottom shows that on average 5.42 more spearmen per unit per battle survive over swordsmen. When you're functioning at high difficulties and the enemy armies are going to outnumber yours and you have to rely on replenishment in order to go from fight to fight, having 5.5 extra spearmen per unit per battle all campaign long makes a really big difference.
This victory is just one step.
And that's why, even though some of the offensive infantry in this game can look really good, by and large, your offense is going to be delivered by other units in your army, so focusing on survivable defensive infantry is going to increase your ability to keep fighting overall. Missiles and artillery. You can talk about them together, even though they're definitely separate categories, because they do share a lot of similarities. Both of them contribute to your army's overall ability to win the fight by beating an opponent, and they do so mostly by doing killing damage to the enemy units. Both of them have the ability to do damage to the opponent without taking any damage in return, so they don't have to exchange anything in order to have to maintain their killing power. Missile units are very often going to outclass melee units in their damage dealing potential. Here are some arranged battles where I have 1 lord, 4 infantry, and 6 crossbowmen. The opponent has 1 lord, 6 infantry, and 4 crossbowmen. And it's on the highest difficulty setting, so the AI has an advantage in melee combat. And you can see how, with minimal tactical maneuvering, I am able to win. Damn it. And that's simply because missile units outclass melee in damage potential. The primary distinction between a siege unit and a missile unit is actually going to be the survivability. Most missile units like archers or crossbowmen are fairly mobile and should be liberally repositioned in battle in order to have the best shot at the enemy. That's not always realistic with a siege unit. Furthermore, missile units can actually last for a few seconds in melee reasonably well in most situations, which means that if a melee unit gets through your lines and get to your missile units, you can actually hold that for just a moment, reposition some neighboring units or something like that in order to provide crossfire, and clear the enemy out. So missile units are capable of looking after themselves quite a bit better than artillery units, which would have no ability to shoot at an enemy that is actively attacking them. Because of their disproportionate killing power, you'll find that in most cases where decent missile units are available, you're going to want the bulk of your army to consist of these units and focus everything else on protecting them or filling in smaller gaps in your army's overall capability. The next category is going to be cavalry units. Cavalry units are incredibly versatile, which means they can also be incredibly confusing. There are 4 primary ways that I use cavalry, and there are probably a few others that other people do, but typically speaking, depending on how you want to employ them, they can do drastically different things for your army. First of all, you can use cavalry for its obvious most basic function and just charge into the enemy. You want to maneuver them around to the backside or the flanks of an enemy formation and then charge. That can do a lot of direct damage because cavalry get charge bonuses that are fairly substantial. And if you don't know how a charge bonus works, it's simply a bonus damage that is delivered if the enemy is getting a running start on their attack, which most cavalry will. In this situation, you're just using the cavalry to do direct damage to some enemy unit. You can also use charges to focus on doing morale or leadership damage. If you have a cluster of enemy units that's starting to waver or that might have a little bit low leadership, charging into the rear or the flank can deliver a crushing blow to leadership and cause them to rout. Sometimes that can cause an overall rout, which leads to victory, sort of a cascading rout. but sometimes it might just be a local one that allows you to win a particular engagement at a particular moment or get an upper hand. The third way I use cavalry is to snipe a high damage or high value enemy unit, especially if they're being really irritating. A distant artillery unit that's kind of hard to get to, or a missile unit that for some reason is just bothering you with missile fire. Having a cavalry unit in reserve somewhere that can work its way around, get to that unit and destroy it or distract it can be invaluable. The final way that I typically employ cavalry is to chase down fleeing enemy units, mostly after a battle is won, but sometimes during the fight as well, in the effort to destroy or at least do as much damage as possible to that unit. The idea here being that if you're going to have to engage this same force again in short order, you're not going to want to contend with these units having recovered and still doing damage to you. You want to take it out and not have to deal with it a second time. So you might be thinking at this point, wow, cavalry sounds like a great unit. They can do all sorts of things. And that's both a strength and a weakness. As a jack of all trades, cavalry units are kind of an expert at none of them. They don't deliver as much damage during a charge as an artillery bombardment or a magic use, say. They're not quite as versatile at consistently damaging units as missiles would be. And while they're extremely consistent at chasing down enemy units after a rout, that's only useful in very limited situations. So what I would recommend is that in most armies, only one or maybe two cavalry units are going to be that useful. The biggest and most obvious exception to this is going to be in Bretonnia, where the bulk of their high-quality units are actually cavalry units. So in the case of Bretonnia, where cavalry is the main tool in their toolbox, you're obviously going to get a lot more utility out of more of those units in your army than you would with most other factions. The fifth common way to use cavalry is a little bit more abstract, and that's as a distraction. Because of their high speed and their mobility, a good quality cavalry unit can actually deploy quite a distance from your main force and draw some of the enemy towards them. With that, you can either kite them around the map or at the very least break off sections of the opponent's army to deal with in waves. Once divided up, it can be a lot easier for you to defeat an enemy that otherwise would overwhelm you. Regarding magic, the best advice I can give is to make sure you're using it. I've seen several armies for struggling players, and my first thought was, where's your wizard? Where's your caster? Magic is essentially a renewable resource that recharges between every battle all campaign long. If you don't take advantage of it at all, you're wasting an incredible resource. Casters also typically have very powerful mounts available that allow them to be decent melee fighters or very agile flying or fast-moving units. There are a lot of videos out there that already go through the schools of magic and the various spells available, so I don't want to retouch on all of that here. But I would recommend going through the spell browser and just reading the descriptions of what's available. Basically anything that provides a heal, summons a unit, does damage that's good against armor, or buffs or debuffs either your melee attack, melee defense, armor, or leadership is going to be a solid choice. The only other things worth mentioning here are base miscast chance and magic power reserve. Base miscast takes place only when you have upgraded a spell past its level 1. Whenever you click on a spell on the battle screen, you activate the level 1 version. Clicking it again will activate the level 2 if you can afford it. Anytime you cast an upgraded spell, there's a chance that the spell will damage the spell caster. Lowering base miscast will reduce the chance of that damage happening, even though the spell will always succeed and go off. There are a lot of ways to reduce base miscast, including banners, items, followers, skills, technology, but most casters also have the earthing skill and the upgraded spell itself, which both reduce it. At the bottom right of the battle screen is a meter that has a big number on it that indicates the amount of winds of magic you have available. Casting a spell will make that number go down. It will slowly recharge based on a smaller meter to the right that is called your magic power reserve. Similar to base miscast, you can increase your magic power reserve in a lot of ways, including technology, banners, followers, etc. Most casters also have a skill, usually called Arcane Conduit, that allows you to increase the magic power reserve and the recharge rate. And honestly, That's about it for the basics in using magic. If you guys would like me to do a more dedicated video on magic, let me know in the comments and I'll see what I can do. So the last category that I want to talk about is monsters. And by monsters, I mean any single entity, large, powerful unit, like a lord, a hero, an actual monster, like a Vargulf with the vampire counts, or the lizardmen, big dinosaurs, but also a mechanical thing like the steam tank. One of the reasons I wanted to talk about monsters last is because they have incredible synergy with the other groups that we've already gone over. For instance, a monster unit can essentially function as infantry, using it as a frontline unit to defend a more vulnerable unit like a magic caster, a piece of artillery, some missile units is a perfectly valid strategy. In fact, monsters often make better infantry units than infantry units because they're usually more mobile and can react to changing situations more quickly. So moving a monster around to the side or to the rear in order to protect a vulnerable flank is a lot more responsive than trying to do the same thing with infantry. Monsters often have knockdown effects or area of effect damage, and therefore can be a lot more effective in physical combat than an infantry unit, while still being of comparable durability. Not only that, they tend to synergize really well with missile units for the same reason. They automatically create the space you need to shoot gun units or even just archers and crossbows through gaps instead of needing to position an infantry unit precisely. Your own missile fire and area of effect damage from something like an artillery unit is very likely to do negligible damage to a large monster as opposed to tremendous amounts of friendly fire that you can achieve by shooting at your own infantry formations. In fact, monsters can be better as frontline units than infantry simply because enemy units have a tendency to cluster around them. So some of the enemy soldiers will actually have their backs or sides exposed to your missile lines, making the shots more effective than if they're trying to shoot over the head of your infantry unit or directly into the face of the enemy opponent, where shield defenses will protect them from a certain amount of your missile damage. Because of their mobility, high damage output, area of effect attacks, and charge bonuses, monsters can actually be used in the place of cavalry in most situations as well, causing a rout or significant damage to an exposed flank or back in an enemy formation. Not all monsters are that mobile though, like treemen from the Wood Elves or rotting leviathans in the Vampire Coast, so you're going to want to test it out before you rely on them for their charge abilities. Much like with missiles or artillery, monsters synergize very well with spellcasters. By causing the enemy to cluster around them, the spellcaster has a perfect target for a vortex or a wind spell that will hit a large number of enemy units. Your monster will take friendly fire damage from the spell, but it will be negligible compared to the monster's health and devastating to the enemy formation. Lastly, monsters often have access to special abilities that make them a little bit unique. For instance, dragons and other flying units can get over city walls and attack units behind. They can also fly over the battlefield to attack vulnerable artillery positions or missile units. Dragons and hydras also have a breath attack that doesn't require winds of magic, essentially giving you a free AoE spell to use against the enemy. By this point, you've probably worked out that I'm a big proponent of the offensive power of artillery units and missile units, and also the durability and sturdiness of monster units as a front line. So what about monster units that are also artillery? Isn't that a very powerful combination? Yes. When you have that sort of unit available, I definitely recommend putting it in your army. The obvious choice is the Necrofex Colossus for the Vampire Coast, but there are others, including the Empire's Steam Tank, the Beastman's Cygor, the Lizardman's Stegodon, and some of their Bastiladons as well, but the Stegodon is the best one, and the Bone Giant in the Tomb King's roster. In fact, some of those units, most notably the Necrofex Colossus, have such a powerful combination of offense and defensive capabilities that some people recruit entirely that unit for whole armies. This is often referred to as a doom stack, and it makes a lot of sense in certain contexts. For one thing, a doom stack requires fewer skill points and technologies to max out the army's potential. If you're going up the red line skill tree of any lord, you'll notice they have the ability to buff certain units in their army. If your entire army consists of one unit, you only need a few skill points to max it out. Same thing with technologies. Instead of having a half a dozen different unit types that you need to research bonuses for, you only have one. With such a powerful and durable monster functioning as both your frontline and your artillery units, all you really need is a couple of magic casters to round out the army's overall capability. The Vampire Coast have vampire fleet captains with the lore of vampires, the Empire has a life mage, and the Lizardmen have a life slan, which is recruited through a special ritual. With that, we've gone over the basics of every unit category in the game. If you guys would like more details regarding a particular category or a particular faction and how they might differ from the norm, let me know in the comments and I'll get on it. Remember to like and subscribe and all that jazz, and I hope to see you again for the next video. Thank you so much, guys.